Welcome to Fiction at the Friary and to our first event of 2021. Fiction at the Friary is a free monthly fiction event held in Cork City, Ireland. My name is Madeleine Darcy, and since January 2017, myself and my good friend Danielle McLaughlin have curated and co-hosted this event. I'd like to thank our current sponsors, the Arts Council of Ireland, Cork City Council, the School of English at University College Cork, J. Rap O'Mara Solicitors, Hogan Architects, and Mike Darcy of the Friary Bar. Normally our events are held in the Friary Bar in real life, but since March last year, we have been obliged to run a virtual pre-recorded event instead. So we miss all our friendly supporters, our audience, our open mic readers, and we hope you're all keeping safe and well and that we'll see you again in real life when times are better. Today is a very special event because I've managed to persuade my co-host, Danielle McLaughlin, to swap roles and be our guest author for a change. As well as being a great friend and a truly lovely person, Danielle is an amazing multi-award winning, multi-talented author. And I felt it was only right and proper to seize the chance to celebrate the publication of her long-awaited debut novel, The Art of Falling. I have, in fact, roped in the lovely Emer Ryan, another wonderful writer based in Cork, to chat to Danielle about her novel. So in a while, after we've finished, I will let you know how to win some free books in our book raffle, and we'll also be posting a writing prompt. But for now, I'm going to introduce Danielle to you all. Danielle's debut collection of short stories, Dinosaurs on Other Planets, was published in Ireland in 2015 by the Stinging Fly Press, and in the UK and US and Canada by John Murray and Random House in 2016, and received rave reviews. In 2019, she was awarded a Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. She was writer in residence at UCC for 2018 to 2019. She has also won the Sunday Times Audible Short Story Award, the William Trevor Elizabeth Bowen International Short Story Competition, the Willesden Short Story Prize, the Merman Short Story Competition, and the Dromineer Literary Festival Short Story Competition. Her stories have appeared in the New Yorker, the Irish Times, the Stinging Fly, and various anthologies. Her debut novel, The Art of Falling, has been published by Random House in the US in January 2021 and by John Murray in February in the UK and Ireland. And already the rave reviews are rolling in. So why wouldn't we celebrate this as our first event in January? The Sunday Business Post has said of Danielle's novel, after a dozen years penning short fiction, The Art of Falling is her first novel. Can she hold the reader's attention over a longer form? The answer is a resounding yes. In the Times, John Self says that Danielle has rightly won a string of awards for her short fiction. The good news is that The Art of Falling lives up to those achievements. Publishers Weekly says that McLaughlin's descriptions of the art and its appeal have an almost mythic quality, and she has a gift for precise characterization. This engaging and evocative work will stay with readers. Now, I suppose I could keep going, but I won't. I'm going to hand over to Emer Ryan, and I'll just say a few words about Emer, who's kindly stepped in to chat with us today. Emer is currently the UCC Writer in Residence for 2021 to 2022, and her writing has appeared in Winter Papers, Granta, the Dublin Review, The Stinging Fly, and various anthologies. She's the editor of the literary journal Banshee, And her debut novel, Holding Our Breath, will be published in June 2021. So that's something else to look forward to. And I'm going to hand you all over to Emer.
Thanks so much, Madeline, and thanks so much for asking me to co-host Fiction at the Friary. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and Danielle to talk about Danielle's brilliant debut novel, The Art of Falling. I think to start off, it'd be great, Danielle, if you could just read a couple of pages from the novel.
Okay, so a little bit about the book very briefly to introduce this extract. My main character, Nessa, her marriage is coming back together after her husband's affair, and she's also excited to be in charge of a new project at work where she's curating a retrospective exhibition of the work of the artist Robert Locke. But unfortunately for Nessa, her past intrudes on her present at the worst possible time. I thought I would read an extract where Nessa goes to visit the Locke family home, which is near Tragumna in West Cork, and she meets Loretta Locke, the artist's daughter. "I'm afraid we're running behind," Loretta Locke had said on the doorstep. My mother took a bit of a turn. The first time she'd used that phrase, a bit of a turn, Nessa had been alarmed, but it turned out that Loretta used it to mean anything from a mild stroke to a fit of bad temper. "Is she all right?" Nessa stepped over the leaves of an encroaching plant and onto the porch. Things grew with lush vulgarity here. Maybe it was the sea air, all those tiny particles of seaweed, all those hapless microorganisms blown inland to fertilize reedy fields. "Old Mother is absolutely fine." Loretta inclined her head to the small room at the end of the hall where Nessa usually spoke with Mrs. Locke. "I've left you the newspaper." They were standing outside the studio where Robert Locke had worked on a number of his better-known pieces. Before the Lockes came to the house in the late 60s, the room must have been a sitting room. It was wide and bright, with 2 tall windows looking out to sea, another smaller window to the side, a ceiling with subdued cornicing and 1 bare light bulb in the centre. Gravity, nominated for the Turner in 1985 and now in the National Gallery, had been conceived and shaped in this room. Venus at the Hotel Negresco, known locally as the chalk sculpture, was here still. Over 7 feet tall, it commandeered the room, part human female, part abstract. The chalk wasn't strictly speaking chalk at all, but a soft gypsum Locke had experimented with fleetingly in his middle years. Come September, the sculpture would move to a more fitting space in the gallery in the city, and the studio would move with it. The door, the floor, the ceiling, even the dust would be transported. "I'll be in here if that's all right," Nessa said, indicating Locke's studio. "I've 1 or 2 things to check." "Of course," Loretta said. "We won't be long." Locke's daughter was in her late 40s, tall and lean with close-cut auburn hair. She wore the kind of clothes that elicited politeness from shop assistants. That day it was tailored navy trousers, a striped blue and white shirt under a camel-coloured sweater. It was humid, dull save for a dazzle of light miles out at sea, and Nessa hadn't worn any tights. She noticed that her legs, pale and dappled here and there with old bruises, complemented the floorboards. She'd already measured every inch of this floor on her hands and knees, photographed it, sketched it on gridded paper over a series of afternoons in preparation for the gallery's acquisition of the studio. She'd marked in pencil the exact location of Robert Locke's chair, his workbench still with its rasps and chisels. The cast iron statue, half stoat, half man, that had stood so long in one place that when she'd moved it, she'd found 2 perfect imprints of its clawed iron feet on the floor. She had liaised with the conservationist, commissioned the survey and the elevational drawings. She had tagged. She had devised a computerized archive. Already some things had been packed into boxes with typed labels on the outside, a catalogue number in the top right-hand corner. The chalk sculpture stood in the middle of the room. It had achieved notoriety some years before, when it came to be regarded as embodying fertility powers. The public had sought it out in their hundreds. They came in a spirit of supplication, less to marvel at what critics had described as the piece's gritty transcendence, its alien, unsettling beauty, than to plead their case. Nessa walked over and touched a hand to the swell of the figure's belly. The sculpture had once languished for a period in a disused cowshed in Clonakilty before the farmer, reportedly tired of it, delivered it by tractor and trailer back to the Loch women, Robert Loch being dead by then. Nessa touched a finger to the indent in the centre of the chalk-white belly. A groove had formed from the already water-damaged gypsum being eroded by the hands of pilgrims. Nessa wondered about these people who'd flocked not to consider Robert Loch's genius, but to beg for babies. She had rescued the sculpture from such indignities. But when the gallery had set about acquiring it, parts still had a dungish tinge from the years in the cowshed. The conservationist had spent days with a small brush, engaged in the complicated process of cleaning without erasing. And I think I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Danielle. I love that image of the statue being transported in a tractor and trailer from the cowshed back to the Loch. That was brilliant. I wanted to ask you actually about how the character Nessa first came to you. Because as you explained at the start there's kind of 3 main strands to the novel. There's the kind of the marriage story and the aftermath of infidelity, the controversy that comes up in her work with regard to the chalk sculpture. And finally, she's kind of forced to reckon with the death of an old friend when the friend's husband and son kind of arrive back in her life unexpectedly. And they're all so meaty and fascinating, but they're also like braided together really effortlessly, I think, throughout. But I wondered which one of those 3 stories was like your entry point into Nessa, and how did the rest of the novel come together then?
So there was a weave that happened over time. So of those elements, the chalk sculpture was there first. So I can identify the chalk sculpture going back to 2012. And then Nessa, she was a mix. I had some characters that were in my head that I knew I wanted to write a novel about, and I knew they had interesting dynamics between them, but they didn't quite have a story. I also had a character in my head from one of the stories in Dinosaurs on Other Planets, a mother and daughter in that, and I saw them as living in a house near the river in Cork City, or I had when I wrote the short story about them. So Nessa kind of emerged from that soup and took shape over time. So there is a little bit in the very beginning of The Art of Falling where it slightly almost overlaps with that short story just for a few pages. And the mother and daughter from the short story are in there. I think I saw the dynamic of the marriage and the mother-daughter relationship in The Art of Falling as having a lot of similarities with the dynamic I'd imagined for that other family in Dinosaurs on Other Planets. So they began with that kind of similar mix of relationships and conflicts, but then Nessa's story grew, I suppose, a whole past centered for Nessa that I hadn't at all even thought of or been interested in exploring in the short story. And there was very much the story of the chalk sculpture, then the piece of art that was one of the constants in the writing of the novel, because in the early days when I was trying the idea for the chalk sculpture as a short story, it kept changing as I tried different things with it, but the chalk sculpture itself, that piece of art, that was always there in some form or another. So the chalk sculpture as a piece of art arrived like very much its own thing with its own presence in my head back in 2012, and that lasted through all the different versions, and the characters kind of grew at their own pace around that and around the different strands.
I'm fascinated as well by the figure of Robert Locke, who's kind of this ghostly figure almost in the novel, in that, you know, Nessa is kind of interacting with him through his art and through his family members, and she's also remembering back to a few times as an art student that she actually met him. So I just wanted to know, did you have a lot of fun in kind of creating this whole backstory and biography for this fictional artist, and were there any real life inspirations for him?
No real life inspiration, so he's entirely made up, but yeah, that was great fun actually, because I really liked the fact that he had to have a body of work. So I had to invent different sculptures that he would have made, and I had to think about what he might have made at different stages of his life. And it was fun to kind of think about things like his influences. So what might have influenced him to make these particular pieces, and how maybe that tied in with his life story, how that tied in with elements that we were discovering about him in the course of the novel. So that was great fun, yeah, thinking about where he came from, what the landscape of that place might have been. And it was also a way of looking at how people talk about art, because there's the versions perhaps that you know, academic commentators have put forward about what his influences were and what led to the different aspects of his work. And then there's what we come to learn about him as, you know, during the course of the novel, which actually is maybe very different things that have gone into creating a piece. So it was fun to kind of have, I suppose, to have that knowledge as the writer, where I knew at different points things that had made Robert Locke's work the way they were, and to be able to show that side by side with what was said about him, because I think things that were said about him and his work were not necessarily a reflection of the truth always.
One of the interesting themes in the book is money and how it kind of impacts on the different characters and their relationships. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about how money kind of impacts on Nessa in her friendships with her old college friends, in her marriage, and even in her relationship with her younger self.
I think money is a complicated issue for Nessa. I think she has a lot of insecurities around it. And I think Nessa has insecurities around class, for example. I think that she feels that perhaps Philip and some of his friends and Philip's family were better off and of a higher class than she was. And I think she, I won't call her a social climber, but she's certainly very tuned into where she is socially and how much money she would like to have. And I think that is tied to her ideas about what she needs to survive. So I think it's an insecurity for her. I imagine her as someone who grew up without much money and who believes that money has an answer of some sort for her. I think she sees it as a security thing. And because her financial position has worsened because of the economic crash, I think that has had an unsettling effect on her. And I suppose I'm also interested in the way that she has, in part at least, been left in this position financially because of her husband's property dealings. And this is something that she didn't cause, but she is trying to sort out. And I felt it very much mirrors the emotional turmoil in the aftermath of his affair, that he had the affair, but she's the one really working hard to try and sort it out. So I think she has insecurities emotionally, and they are merged with the way she feels about money. She's quite insecure about money.
Danielle, one of the things that I really enjoyed about The Art of Falling was the very, very skilled mix of sadness, tragedy, and humor. You know, I mean, you describe, for example, a certain sexual incident in Nessa's past, and it is both really funny and awfully, awfully excruciatingly, embarrassingly horrible. And again, there is a dinner party where I laughed out loud at one of the characters observed through Nessa's eyes as a real pain in the neck, really. And she's really interested in books and wants to talk to her about books. And the dinner party goes on, and it is hideously embarrassing for Nessa, but as well as feeling sorry for her, I couldn't help but find it very funny. And I love that combination of humor and tragedy, you know, the black comedy. How do you manage that? Or does it sort of appear by accident and then you embroider it a little?
I think that black humor comes into the novel, in part anyway, because it's set in Cork. And I think Cork people are very much wired that way. I think when we're kind of grappling with something sad, or maybe when we're kind of stressed or wound up and we're a little bit angsty with someone, we're inclined to go for those maybe sharp or that comic humorous edge, I suppose. I think Cork people, maybe Irish people generally do tend to mix humor with very awful things. I think it often just comes through in what people say to each other. I think in dialogue, it just wanders into the scene. But I think it is because it's set in Cork, and this is the way these people think. I think they're just wired to kind of throw a bit of humor in if they're dealing with something dark, or if they're in bad temper.
It's also a great way of dealing with tragedy, you know, to find that black humor. And as Emer said at the beginning, the idea of this chalk sculpture in a disused shed and then being put on the back of a lorry and with very little respect is very funny and very typical. And I also loved, I have to say, I wondered, was it deliberate that you were referring to the disused shed of Derek Mahon's poem?
Well, you know, that's the second time within a week that I've been asked that question, and I wasn't consciously referring to Derek Mahon's poem, but obviously I would have heard it lots of times, so maybe in some way it kind of crept in there through my subconscious, but I hadn't planned it that way, but someone else has also picked up on that disused shed. So I think it was hanging around in my brain and jumped out onto the page at that point, but I hadn't realized it.
finally, Danielle, can I ask you one more question? And that is, are you planning a sequel to this novel? Because I feel that I want to follow these characters in their trajectory and see what's going to happen next, because it's, you know, a number of strands in the novel, and they're wonderfully interesting strands, have been resolved by the end, but some things have not been resolved at all.
Yeah, there's definitely some things that are left open at the end. I don't have any plans to write a sequel, so the characters are going to have to row their own boat and sort their own lives out, or not sort them out and just leave them to their own devices at this stage. I have written another novel since, so it's well, I say I've written it, I haven't shown it to anyone, and I'll have to do lots more drafts yet, but it's totally unrelated, and this next one is set in a very rural area, inland, so totally different.
Interesting. Well, that'd be another great thing, a good, great thing to look out for in the future. And can I ask you, Danielle, finally, how has it been for you? I know that we all, Emer and you and I, all have a lot of good friends who have had novels or short story collections or poetry collections or whatever delayed because of the pandemic and the challenges that has caused. And it must be a strange thing now to finally be publishing a novel when we're still not, essentially in Ireland, we're in a very serious lockdown situation again in January 2021. How are you coping with that? How are you managing?
Well, I have to admit to being in an enormous state of stress and anxiety these days, but I can't say one way, you know, I'm not sure how much of that is related to publishing the book in a pandemic or just the pandemic, because when this all started, when we were in the first lockdown, you know, it was fine to cope with in the beginning. And I actually thought, well, I'm an introvert anyway, you know, I'm going to be good at this lockdown business and it's not going to affect me at all. And I don't need to be out there meeting people. But the longer it went on, it did really begin to get me down. So publishing a book in a pandemic, I would say, yes, you know, I'm finding it hugely anxious making, and it is very stressful, but I don't know how much of that is just this whole ongoing lockdown business rather than anything to do with the book.
One of the things I loved about the book was your ability to show how the different characters see the world. Like Nessa, obviously she's an art historian. When she walks into someone's house, the first thing she notices is what art do they have on the walls. And Philip, similarly, he's an architect and he's always thinking about angles and light and just the structure of any room that he's in. Are you yourself, are you a very visual person that way, or how did you kind of write your way into those perspectives?
That thing about noticing what the character would notice, because you know, you're right, different people will notice different things, and what we notice is, it says a lot about us, you know, as individuals. What are the things that we notice in any given situation? And I think it's one way of allowing the reader an insight into a character is to let the reader see what the character sees. And I think that was something that I learned by doing writing workshops, because it's something I wouldn't have been able to do at all in the beginning. And when I was starting out, I very much struggled to get close to characters. I really had to work very hard to try and bring my reader, you know, up close to the character. And I can't remember what writing instructor it was that taught me. Maybe it's a whole series of them, but I do remember that it was something I learned over time just through doing workshops, to think in terms of what this character would notice, because what one person notices and what another person will notice will be completely different things, and that difference goes to the heart of who they really are as people, I think. So that was very much a learned thing over the years. Yeah, I suppose I'm visual more so than hearing things, and that I do tend to see the story before I hear it. So yeah, I do work more with pictures than sound.
I have only one more question, and it was that as someone whose debut was a short story collection, very acclaimed short story writer, you've written a novel and the draft of a second novel. As you were writing those two novels, did you find short stories kind of coming into your mind and trying to distract you away from the longer project? And if so, how did you manage that?
So I kept writing short stories alongside the novels. So I think I've maybe, since the first collection, I've maybe written about a dozen short stories since my first collection was published, and I have at the moment, I have maybe 3 or 4 stories under construction at the moment, so I am always writing them. I don't know that I have any particular way of, I suppose it's because maybe I need to impose more regimentation on myself, because I don't keep track of how long I spend on one thing or on another. I just kind of stick with whichever one is, you know, working best at the moment. And if I stop or get stuck, I'll just move to something else then and go back and forth. So sometimes I think I really need to sit down and, you know, drop a timetable, say 2 hours at this and then 2 hours at that. But I have tried that. I'm not very good at sticking to it.
It's good to hear that it's a helpful distraction rather than as in they kind of feed one another in some ways?
It helps me, I think, in that I like having these different things to work on. I don't ever find that they compete with each other. You know, I've heard some writers say that they feel they're kind of cheating on one thing when they're working on the other. And I don't feel that, because they seem to have their own very particular interests, you know. So. Now, that said, The Art Falling did start out from the spark of what I thought was a short story. So, but that's one of the few times that anything started out as a short story and became something else. Usually they stay and they do their own thing. If they're a short story, they're a short story, and the novel does its own business. It's like they stay on 2 separate sides of the room.
Can I ask you, on a practical level, how do you manage to be so productive? And do you use such things as Scrivener to order your files, for example, particularly for the novels?
You mentioned Scrivener, and a couple of years ago, several people actually recommended Scrivener to me, and I never looked into it. And last year, for the second novel that I'm doing, I got Scrivener and I really like it. So my new novel is being written on Scrivener and I really like it and I find it very handy. And also with the second novel, I used an idea that I got from Elizabeth Rosemary at Fiction at the Friary one Sunday. And she talked about draft 0, that she does a draft 0 where perhaps over the course of just 1 month, she just writes very roughly. She writes for 1 month this very rough draft 0. And I thought that was a great idea. And I did the draft 0 approach with the new novel, and that was a big help as well.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for being our guest author at Fiction at the Friary in January 2021. Thank you so much, Emer, for co-hosting on this wonderful occasion when we get to celebrate Danielle's debut novel, which is available in all good shops soon, I think. We will be raffling some free books. So after this event, you can check on Twitter at Fiction Friary and on Facebook at Fiction at the Friary for a chance to win. And we'll also post, as usual, a writing prompt for those of you who are interested. And we'll be back again on the final Sunday in February. So thank you all very much for checking in, and keep safe and well.